Good evening. Well, it feels like evening here as the sun has already gone down or is going down. Welcome everyone to the final speaker series event for the fall semester. We are extremely lucky to be closing out the semester with Dr. Tracie Keesee. But before I introduce tonight's guest, I would like to encourage you all to return next semester to enjoy a continuation of this conversation in which our guests are asked to engage with us in a reimagining of community safety. The guest list is still a work in progress for the spring, but thus far we have confirmed Keela Jackson, who heads up Massachusetts Housing's public safety, and she will join us to share all of the work of the hub in Jamaica Plain. Rasan Hall, the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Charles Ransford, senior director of science and policy at Cure Violence Global. Molly Baldwin, the founder and chief executive officer of ROCA Incorporated. Kat Brooks, who is one of the leaders of Anti-Police Terror Project in Northern California. And Candace Montgomery and Miski Noor, leaders of the queer-led collective Black Visions, a grassroots organization known for putting public pressure on Minneapolis city officials to fight police brutality and inequities by defunding the police and finding alternative measures to keep communities of color, immigrants, and trans people safe, and to allow its members to heal. We have a few more invitations out, including but not limited to the leaders of 8 to Abolition and Arizona's POTR in Action, and we're waiting to hear back. If these invitations are accepted as well, the spring semester's lineup promises to be truly exceptional. So exceptional. That is a term that I think so well describes our guest tonight. Dr. Tracie Keesee is the Senior Vice President of Justice Initiatives and co-founder of the Center for Police Equity. This critical position expands upon the core mission of CPE, justice through science. She oversees all law enforcement relationships and program implementation. Additionally, she works closely with communities to ensure their representation and participation in the co-production of public safety. Prior to her return to CPE, she served as the first ever Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion for New York Police Department, the NYPD. As the Deputy Commissioner of Equity and Inclusion, Dr. Keesee was responsible for overall organizational development and implementation of the NYPD's Equity and Inclusion Strategic Framework. She also served as an advisor to the Police Commissioner on the implementation of accountability systems that monitor training, recruitment, employee opportunities, and complaints in order to help increase the organization's ability to attract and retain an inclusive and diverse workforce. Dr. Keesee is also a retired 25-year veteran of the Denver Police Department and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from the Metropolitan State College of Denver, academic certifications in public policy and public administration, and a Master's of Arts degree in criminal justice from the University of Colorado at Denver, and a PhD in intercultural communications from the University of Denver. Certification in diversity and inclusion as well from Cornell University. She is also a graduate. You would think that Dr. Keesee was like 80 or 90 years old, given all that she's accomplished, but she is also a graduate of the 203rd session of the FBI National Academy at Quantico, Virginia. She's published numerous articles across a variety of collected anthologies and peer-reviewed scientific journals. I don't know when and how she sleeps, but this is an impressive resume. Dr. Keesee has chosen to have a conversation with me. And so after 25 minutes, as opposed to give a presentation and open it up for Q&A. So after 25 minutes, I will turn it over to my colleague, Chris Winship, as always. And once Chris has had his questions answered, we will then open it up to the members of our community for Q&A. Please remember to keep your questions clear and, importantly, concise. Doing so will make us all happier at the end of the session. So Dr. Keesee, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here finally.
So much. Thank you for the invitation and for all of that introduction read that makes me feel tired. And,
right. Well, you should be tired after achieving all of that.
Mother, usually when we do that for the tape for mom. So.
I hear you. So let me start by asking you, can you tell me about the Center for Policing Equity? What does it do? What is this organization for?
Sure. So About 12 years ago, Philip Tibagaff and I connected over some work that he was doing in regards to implicit bias. I was still with the Denver Police Department at the time as a commander, and I was grappling with the questions that community were asking me at the time, and really do continue to ask around the death of a young man who was having a mental health crisis. And the question that was posed to me from the community, from my community, was whether or not we trained at the time Denver police officers to shoot and kill young Black men. That was the question. There was nothing else added to that. And I couldn't answer that question. I didn't try to entertain something. I couldn't answer that at the time. And then, of course, Phil was working on a lot of work around implicit bias. Josh Carell was doing a lot of work around shoot, don't shoot bias, decisions to shoot. And so what I'd ask is for help to try to answer that question. And that's how Phil and I connected and really sat through a lot of conversations. The center itself was created to help police chiefs really begin to look at not just their disparities, but policies, culture, in the way in which they interact with community, and are there things that can be done there? So through the data, so as we look at it. Also talking about, evidence-based types of approaches that they should be doing and implementing. We decided to do this because at the time, no one was having this really, robust conversation about race and policing. To this day, we don't charge for that. One of the things that I think that we are extremely proud of is not just that work, but our ability to connect with our other colleagues who've taken this work in different directions to be able to sort of point chiefs in those spaces as well. Our work with community is equally, it's free, but it's challenged right now. And I think among a number of reasons why we all can think of and discuss, and I'm sure you will discuss for years to come, but we are in this in my 30-something odd years in career in policing, and I think there's others probably who are joining us as well, have really come to a place where we are talking about a fundamental shift in the power of police back to community. They've never lost it. I think it's been reactivated. And what does that look like? And what does it mean when you're trying to have an ideal state of public safety? And what does that mean along the way? And so it's a very interesting time we find ourselves in. And so CPE is in that place to sit with chiefs, sit with community, sit with our colleagues, and then step back and allow community to do what they need to do. And what we find ourselves in this moment as we are sitting with a group of around 29 activists, 40 communities from across 11 cities, and it's all different, it's all complicated, it's all painful, and there is just so much work to be done. And so that's sort of where I find myself in my retirement. This is what I do.
So one of the things that you've become known for is this idea of the co-production of public safety. You have a TED Talk on it, et cetera. You go around, you share a vision, and then even ways of achieving this. Can you tell us about what the co-production of public safety is, how it's achieved, what it has achieved since it's been kind of rolled out in various communities?
Well, it's been rolled out in very different ways, but I'll start from the beginning. So what you're mentioning is the TED Talk from a couple of years ago, when I lifted up this notion of co-producing your public safety. It really comes from Eleanor Ostrom from about 1970, who said, if you bring people with their lived experiences into these spaces, including the police, including experts that do the work that police shouldn't be doing, that it hopes to produce a different knowledge, a different perspective, a different way to do this work. It is one in which the power is really moved away from police. Police is up there, a portion or a person at that table. They are not leading. This is different than community policing. And Chris, I think this is one of your questions to me in the email, in that if you remember historically, community policing was not just a philosophy, but it was also very programmatic. But it was really based on and really requiring police to lead and to do interventions in ways that we hoped community would agree with, but it was not really community-centered or community-led. And I want to go back even further. Chris, just tell you how old I am. One of the really first programs that happened under this sort of community policing umbrella that was funded out of DOJ was called Weed and Seed. And if you remember, in those, for folks generationally, that doesn't mean like plant weed and then, do that kind of thing. What it meant was the idea was to go in and weed from community the individuals or issues that were plaguing, depending on who was defining that, and that was funded. And so what did that look like? It looked like tactic control teams going into communities, identifying different people, arresting them. And then interesting enough, the seed money never came. The idea with the seed money was that you would invest in communities and put those pieces in place. And so yet even then in community policing, the relationships were very transactional. With co-production, it can't be transactional, which means that you're going to have to get to the systemic issues of what's really going on in the community and what's going on with policing. And how does that look? And what I usually, when I talk about this, I point to a couple of places, but the one thing that I do point to the most is Erica Ford, who's in New York, who does this work of violence, intervention, who with her team of folks in a very holistic way are initially the first responders when something happens in the community before the police get there. But what that means for Erica and what that means for her team is that she has to have a relationship not only with the community, but in some ways with the police department. And you have to be able to have that recognition that the community preference is to have a community response. When we talk about crisis sort of response teams that are created, they are really created by community on a community level. And those folks that are there are part of the community. They understand what's going on. They understand what trauma looks like. And so it's very different, but it's not new. And we look at models like the Cahoots model out of Eugene, Oregon, where it is community-based. When you're talking about how do you provide services for folks who have mental health and substance abuse issues, we know these things can be done and we know that they are done. The thing that they both lack is funding. And so as we talk about, what does that co-production look like? It looks like that. It looks like the community really being involved in and really helping to focus how those services should be provided. The other thing that's really important to think about as you think about, co-producing public safety is the sort of what I call this sort of really narrow focus on how broadly we're talking about public safety. Because public safety, and much like you just explained for your next, semester lineup, is much more than the police. It's housing security, it's food security, it's health. And, we seem to be in this moment really focused on police, understandable, get it, but there is a lot of different intersections that are happening here. And the fear and my concern is if we focus solely on police, we're gonna miss what has to happen on a broader scale for communities of color, specifically Black and brown communities, to not only just regain safetiness, but to, to thrive and to feel as if they have control over their own livelihood. So it's one of those things where when we talk about this is something that's not new, but I think what's really new and what's being, not new, but I should say what's really being focused on and lifted up now is this decentering of power. And as you and I have talked about, one of the probably bigger concerns I know I have is that it feels as if there will only be a window and a short window to try to get something done. And at that point, you will start to see those who, typically hold the power begin to pull that back. And we're starting to see some of that now. And so there is a tremendous amount of concern, not only about what can we do to make sure that these things stay centered the way they should be so they're appropriate, but how do you sustain it? And I think that is the biggest thing. And Chris, I would say to you, that's the biggest thing with all of this is how do you sustain this type of momentum and this type of work? And the real sort of concern in community policing was also about a power shift, but it was really about the chiefs losing power to a neighborhood police officer, because the neighborhood police officer would be so endowed with so much authority to fix things, to help problem solve, that somehow that shift would mean that the chief becomes powerless, or doesn't seem as, I would say, probably the ability to help seems to be lessened because someone else is doing it that's closer to the ground. And so for me, this has been the conversation. I think what's interesting now and unfortunate is after the homicide of Mr. Floyd, it is pushed as it, rightfully so. But the concern again becomes, as we do the work in the communities, there's so many different perspectives, so many different voices, and that we can't get stuck here. We have to move forward no matter what it looks like And we can't assume it's going to look the same in all communities, because if we do, we're going to just repeat the same mistake.
So it sounds to me like some of what you have described is what some of the activists have been pushing, right? There's a way that they want to decenter the police in terms of public safety and identify the issues that have long-term plagued many, especially low-income communities of color, and provide the funding and resources, the institutional supports to deal with those issues. So in some ways, defund the police is about redirecting resources so that it focuses on helping to create stronger communities, such that you don't even, in some ways, you don't even have to rely as much on police, because you will in effect be addressing some of the core problems that make it so that police might be needed. Do you see the arguments differently?
No, I don't see it differently. What's different is the language that's being used, right? So as we're all coming into this, particular moment in time, you hear defund, you hear abolish, cops hear unemployment, rising crime, and I'm culpable, right? So it's really interesting that we're all talking about really some fundamental same thing, right? Because the cops will tell you, and I'll tell you from my own experience as an officer, showing up to a call and knowing that I'm not the person or the service that they need. And yet I have no access to anything else. So thinking that whatever tools I have, I may be able to get something started. And a lot of times that meant putting someone in the system. And so I think that we are fundamentally talking about the same thing. We are talking about how do we look at efficiencies with police departments. And the first thing that we've been having conversations around is how do you know what the demand is? And part of understanding that means you look at the 911 calls coming in, right? You do the analysis, see what people are asking for. And typically when you look at it, depending on cities, and they're all different, what is being talked about and what's being asked for usually are not lining up. Usually the violent crime or the crime calls are smaller, and everything else is really social related. And so you really have to start thinking about, who are the most appropriate people to be, going to those types of calls. Because what cops will tell you is, I'm going to the same houses, to the same apartments over and over again. I'm engaging with the same people, and yet systems outside of law enforcement seem to be dropping the ball. And yet, as we have these conversations today, a lot of what's being said is being really laid at the feet of law enforcement. And I don't think it's different. And I think that what you really start to hear this is in the public health, the mental health, substance abuse space, right? There is a different way to go at this. There's a different way there, to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. But one of the conversations we have to have as we're talking about how do we offer up different alternatives is if you're moving from one system that's problematic into another one that also has its own issues around race and disparities, we have to be talking about some other things that may not exist yet. And I think that's also becoming very problematic for people. But I don't think we're off when we're talking about what types of resources should be placed where and who should be addressing what types of issues.
Mm-hmm. So my sense is that if we think about a concept like the co-production of public safety, and specifically in these communities that have felt under assault by the police, in some cases felt as if their neighborhoods or communities have been occupied by police. I understand that there is some support for the police from members of those communities because they feel unsafe and want to be protected. But there's a growing percentage of folks who don't want them at all, right? So this is the abolition. I think the percentage, especially of young people who are embracing the notion of abolition might be upwards of 25%, maybe a little higher. And that is way higher than it was 4 years ago, right? So we just see a marching up of those percentages. It's difficult to see how co-production would happen in this kind of space, if only because there's this kind of fragmentation. And also because these are not groups or stakeholders who have similar levels of power, right? The police come into these communities with a whole heap more power than the folks that they're supposed to be engaging in and negotiating with. How do you effectively negotiate in a situation where you have so little power, social, economic, political? It seems like what does co-production look like in that situation?
Well, and I think that's a great question, right? So as we talk about abolitionism, in that particular notion, you're also, from the way I understand it, talking about not having the existence of police at all. So you have to assume that there's been an over amount of investment in the community where you're not necessarily having to engage with police on that level, but you still have to figure out what do you do with violent crime until then. So there's the ideal, which I think is doable, but it's also the questions of what's the path on the way there and what do you do? I think that part of that power shift in the abolitionist piece, if we're talking ideal moment here, is that you do have that power shift that's back, right? But you also have elected officials that understand, what the needs are in the community. You also have investments there. And so you may not need to engage on a different, on the same level that you do now on this current state. Down the road in abolitionism, if they're not there, they also would have a different role. Because one of the things that we're talking about here is what is the role? And if there's not a role for police, what are you going to do with all of these folks? Do you retrain them and move them into something different? But the other part of the abolitionist conversation is around the other groups and other people, and probably like the 70 million that voted the opposite way, that don't believe policing is in trouble, that think that this is fine and that there's only a small 25% of the group of folks here who are trying to do something that's only helpful for a few folks and doesn't benefit everyone. But I think we can have this conversation about how these types of movements towards reducing the footprint in policing does benefit everyone. And I think we're all talking about portions of it. So even with co-production, it's not meant to be the only solution, nor is it the ultimate solution. But it is one along that way if we're trying to get to a space where that power does shift permanently and where we do elect officials that support, whatever versions of the new ideal will be. So I see this as, a movement along the way. And the other concern that we always think about is making sure it doesn't do more harm. That's the other part. And so one of the things that when we think about this particular type of work, it is not necessarily meant to be that it's appropriate for every, movement along the way. And what we're all hoping for, even those who are probably in abolitionism, is that it's going to look completely different. But it's not just this particular system that's going to look different. Because if you're talking about the abolishment of current state of policing into something that's a broader public safety sort of perspective, you have a lot of things that intersect with that are also going to have to be dealt with. So I do think it's something that you certainly can be useful along the way, but it's not, nor is it created to be the end all be all. And we have to be very careful thinking that there's only one way to do this work. And I think that's the other thing too, I would say about how does it show up in the abolition space?
I just have one question before I hand it over to my colleague, Chris. When we had a conversation a couple of weeks back, you shared with me that one of the things that you thought needed to happen was that residents of well, probably many communities, if not most communities, need to have a better understanding of the political process, how you enact change, how you engage with government, local government, so that you can achieve the results that you want. And it reminds me of something that we heard earlier in the semester. So can you share more about that? The levels of knowledge about how to work with community and what might be done in order to kind of educate people about how they might become more engaged in local politics.
What we're finding on the ground, which is really interesting, and I think what I mentioned to you was really sort of heavy heart for me. And it was as we're having these conversations about what does the reimagining, what does the ideal look like, there is really not a complete understanding of governance and how it works. Who's held ultimately accountable? Who should be accountable? And we find this really, so not just on the law enforcement side, but throughout government, right? So how is government supposed to respond to the needs of the people? That doesn't happen. What does that look like? And how do we make sure that this never happens again? One of the things that we talked about, which is an example, is around budgeting. One of the things that, a lot of the things that we hear when we're on, sitting with community and trying to help them think through, if you're going to do strategies, even if you move to the ideal state, you're going to have funding for that ideal state. And even if you abolish or divest from a police department, that is really sort of bucketing yourself for a small amount of money, and then you restrict yourself just to that. And understanding that you may need more. What does that look like? Just don't restrict yourself to these types of things. And the other things that were sort of showing up in that space as well is managing expectations about how quickly those things would even happen, right? Because fiscal budgets are done a year, 2 years in advance. And even if council says we're going to shift, $1 million or $3 million over to you, that's something that's not going to show up the next day. And to hear those conversations where that is the feeling that these things would be immediate is probably one of my biggest concerns. And that is, and there's a lot of folks out there, Measures for Justice, there's a lot of colleagues out there that are doing that work. They're helping them understand this is how it works. This is what a community budget would look like. This is what a democratic, broader conversation around budgets would look like. So there are folks out there trying to help with that. And even the democratization of data, right? Pushing it down, pushing it out, allowing community to do their own analysis, to take a look, to even inform their own decisions. How do you get it? How do you access it? So for me, I think that is probably one of my biggest asks, or for those nonprofits out there that are doing that work, is help folks sit. This is something we don't do. We don't try to take up space and lane, but to step back and say, can you engage this group and say, walk them through how that works. We see this with union budgets, right? We're seeing this a lot, where the community is just now hearing that the union is going to get a raise. This happened just in Denver, where they were due for a 3% raise. The council voted that down. The process is that the city, meaning the mayor and the union, had already negotiated most of it. And so it was just going to vote. Well, they voted it down. An arbitrator overturned their vote yesterday. And so they will be getting the raise. And so it's those processes, it's those things that community really does not understand how those happen. But it's also incumbent upon a lot of folks to educate, help them understand, why aren't you in that space? Why aren't you able to, weigh in on what's happening? And this is, a lot of this is what really gets you to that end goal. If it is about, reducing footprints and abolitionism, it is understanding processes and governance and how you need to get in here and figure out what you need to either pull apart or, move on and do something different. So thank you for lifting that. But yeah, that's one of those things that really, for me, is really problematic.
Yeah, absolutely understandable. My sense is that the folks in Minneapolis, Black Visions Collective, that this is one of the things that they seek to do on the ground, educating folks. And so I look forward to hearing more from them. Thank you, Dr. Keesee. I'm going to pass it over to Chris. It was wonderful to hear from you, and I look forward to hearing the rest of this conversation.
Absolutely. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. I'm off. So thank you so much. Got you a drink of water for coming. Let me ask two related questions. This whole issue about language has just come up, and former President Obama has just come up yesterday being very critical of the abolition of it and defund the police language. What kind of language could we find that would allow parties to really start talking with each other? And I think this relates to the question I also emailed you about Alex, who thinks communities and police, they shouldn't work together. When that happens, it stigmatizes the process because there's so much hate, distrust out there of the police. So let me kind of put those two together and ask you to answer them however you want.
Thank you. So the issue of, communities not working with police is something that we hear. And I don't think Alex needs me to validate that. It does create issues, and there are communities right now who are trying to do this work and, reimagine this work, who do not want police involved in that work. And we're not talking about the abolitionist piece, we're just talking about getting there, right? What does that piece look like? One of the things that we always talk about as well is that's true, but at some point there has to be an understanding of what it is you're trying to shift, right? So if you don't understand policing culture or component parts, that information has to get to you somehow. may not be through police, could be through everyone else. It could be from other community members on the ground, but you're going to at some point have to be able to get that information, whatever that looks like. So again, I'm not saying that it's wrong, because we have communities now who are saying, no, we don't want to do this. And we have other folks pushing, saying, if you want to try to make change permanent, different, abolition, you're going to have somebody who understands how those systems work, so you don't end up repeating. So that's what I would say to that. And the challenge is going to be, how do you do this? Because you're really talking about, what we mentioned, talking about power. And at some point, you talk about what does that look like for a community who doesn't want to engage with someone who is right now trying to pull back on what we see as decentering. So that's one thing. So not to create another question, but the other issues around language, which you just mentioned, and what's interesting, and it's not just the language. I think it's what we call trigger words, right? And trigger words have a purpose and a place. They have a purpose and they have a place. That's true no matter what we do. But when I talk about language and shared language, I mentioned this, I think, probably just a couple of days ago in a conversation. If we are all talking about removing police from specific calls, social spaces, and places, we agree on that, right? And so we agree. If we talk about defunding, divesting, it depends on who's defining it, right? For me, it's an efficiency. It is, what are they doing that they shouldn't be doing based on what the community's needs and asks are? And if there is an efficiency in there where they have spent lots of money to staff up a particular unit to do that job, that's the efficiency. That means that you have to move that off. And I think that what we do is we talk about those things separately, but we are talking about the same thing. It feels personal on the police side. I'm just going to tell you, it feels personal on the police side. When you say abolish, I think of my career. I think of all of the work that I do. And these are folks who do genuine, honest, or try to do that work. And I think that that's the other thing. It feels very personal. This does not take away from the historical wrongs and damage that's been done in the Black community. And so what we have are these sort of parallel tracks that are, saying some things equally, but there's just that we call trigger language that they can't come into that space. And some of it is not just about language. It is about the lived experience. We have to understand that. But what we try to do in our conversations is we do just that. When you say, divest, we sit with that group locally and say, can you define what that means for them so they understand? The abolitionists will say, we don't need you at all. We understand that part. People who say divest, reinvest, we mean take money that you don't need or we don't think you need, or the amount of staff that we don't think you need, and move that somewhere else. And so it's really down to the locality. And even with activists, there's not even an agreement about what we really mean when we say X and Y. So language does matter here.
So the next semester, we have several people coming that are from Boston that I think, in terms of how you describe co-production, are in the co-production business with the police department. And I guess I'd just like to invite you to come to an LJ Baker meeting that happens every Wednesday morning. Easy to come now, they're on Zoom. And I'd love to have a discussion with you about sort of what Boston's been up to for the last 20 years, something I've been involved in. And particularly to end it now, open it up to say, what's going on in Boston is not the David Kennedy model. It is not remotely the David Kennedy model. And I'm sure you're quite familiar. And Phil and I have certainly talked about what's going on in Boston a lot. I'll send you an email, but thank you so much for coming in.
Absolutely, I will. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think we have a question from Brian Core. Brian, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. I had to unmute myself. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Keesee, Tracy. It's great to see you, and I really appreciate your thoughts and your remarks. So as you may know, but others may not, one of the things I'm very focused on in my work on civilian oversight is the role of trauma. And since you were just talking about how this conversation about defunding the police lands very differently, I would just love to hear any thoughts you have about the role of trauma, personal, historical, community trauma, and how that plays out as we're having this conversation on rethinking policing from, I hate to use this phrase, from both sides, from the community and for police and police officers.
Trauma plays a big role in this, Brian. And it is not just historical trauma, it's lived trauma, current trauma, it is generational trauma. It plays a really big part here. And it looks different in different ways. And I can tell you the colleague we work with the most on trauma is Dr. Angel Acosta, who does work on contemplative care. And really, it is about how people show up in a space who've been traumatized for a real long time. And it can look very different. When people have the microphone, as we say, or when they are invited into a space where they feel safe, they will talk about all of those things that happened. And sometimes it may not seem that it's tracking or it's coherent, but when you first are allowed to feel that you are safe and comfortable enough to say that, it comes out however it comes out. I often find that people who have not been trained or aware of what trauma looks like on some folks, and some will stay quiet, some will not, engage at all, that they take that in some cases as non-interest, or they can't seem to let go of the past. And so, I hear these things in the conversation in regards to whether or not it's been asked or answered, right? And so it really shows itself in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that we have implored not just law enforcement to do, but one, to understand not just community trauma, but their own trauma. Police have been same space, right? So as I talk to patrol officers on the ground, and I always remind people this, policing is local and police officers don't make policy. They enact it. And so it is, again, a groups of people who are trying to figure out what's going on with their world and not trying to elevate anybody, above anyone else, but the trauma is real. And if you don't understand it, if you don't see it, it's also going to impact your ability to begin to figure out how you move towards whatever the ideal is. But we still find a lot of folks who do not do trauma-informed work. Interesting enough, the groups we find that are very much and tuned in line with it are those community nonprofits on the ground in the communities who are dealing strictly with community issues. And so it is very present, to answer your question. And if you don't recognize that, and if you don't account for it, even in ourselves, even at me, for the work that I've done for 30 years, and the hard part about thinking about your own complicity in some of the types of things that you may or may not think you were doing, and all of that counts. And so people have to be aware of that, and people have to account for it, and people have to give grace and patience for it. And we find some folks more than others don't seem to have that.
All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I'll jump back in with another question, Dr. Keesee. Recently, you were a part of the Boston Police Task Force, Reform Task Force. I'm mixing it up, I'm sure. Task force with many members who put forward a set of recommendations that Boston Mayor Walsh has basically fully embraced. And my understanding is that his hope is to kind of roll this out in less than a year, in around 6 months or so. And it included things like implicit bias training, expanding the body worn cameras, creating an independent oversight review board, collecting more data. There's one other that I'm forgetting, but you get the point. And I wrote an op-ed that was published in the Boston Globe soon after word got out that the mayor decided to embrace these proposals. And I made the argument that these won't work. We have quite a bit of empirical research done on each of these topics, and there's so limited, there's almost no evidence to support that any of these things will actually have impact on the ground. This includes implicit bias training, et cetera. I mean, New York City spent what, 6 million, 4 million, I can't remember how much they spent to train their officers. And the report that came out just a couple of months ago basically said it had no impact. And that was just one of many studies that have been done and in each of these areas. And so it strikes me that a lot of the kind of reform efforts that are put forward, and then I think that the task force put forward, although I'll be very clear, if I remember correctly, they made the point that this should be the floor, more can and should be done. These are reforms that nibble around the edges and don't really kind of have a true impact on changing the lives of the people in these low-income communities of color that are often affected by police brutality, these inequities. Can you share with me the logic of putting forward proposals when at this point we do have evidence to suggest that it doesn't really go very far? During a moment of transformational change, which we both argued is now quickly closing, can you share with me your thinking? And then you all mentioned the floor. Where would you go if you could have proposed more?
So, and I think you've already lifted this up. I think that, there's lots of voices there. So I'm not going to own all of this, but I'll own my part in which I contributed to this, and we'll just sort of talk through each of them the way I see it. I think that what you mentioned in your op-ed article, I mean, some of the data is limited, some of it is not, not really known. I think that's part of the issue. We don't know because we don't do really good data collection on what we're actually doing. That's part of it. Doesn't mean that we should stop necessarily on some things and move forward on others, but again, it's the floor. And I think that here is where the problem lies. So for example, let's just talk about the implicit bias piece of this, because that's probably the biggest one, not the only one, but one of the bigger ones, right? So we know that over the last 4 or 5 years, police departments have begun to do implicit bias training and procedural justice training. And even in the creation of those trainings and the thinking about how do we do this work, that work was never thought of as the solution. And I think that's where we have to be very careful. When we're talking about groups of officers, not all, and I say, this because it doesn't apply to everybody, who are not aware around how their interactions impact communities, how their biases influence their work, is a floor. That is a floor. You need to know that. You should understand that. I can tell you in my own academy, and even in NYPD during my time there, that was a topic that was never talked about, let alone the history of that uniform and how those things came to be. So I wouldn't think of what has been put in that particular report as the end all, right? We know that implicit bias has short-term impacts and it doesn't have long-term. But again, those were not designed to do exactly what we're trying to do. It is, how do you make them aware? How do you make them at least begin to think about what they're doing? The challenge, which the challenge continues to be, is how do you turn those impacts into long-term impacts, where you actually see behavior change? We're going to have the same challenges with anti-racism training that has not been studied, that has not been shown to move the needle or to move the behavior. This is probably one of the weaknesses of a lot of the work that's being done, but the power of it is that it's the floor, it's something. We cannot not deal with a police force and not have any types of parameters or accountability or guidance around them. And as we work towards other things, do I think these are the only things? No. Do I think that body-worn cameras are going to, do what they were originally sort of challenged to do? I was on the 21st Century panel for IT. I mentioned the fact this is not the end-all solution. We still don't know. The studies on body-worn cameras are really new. Other than Jennifer Eberhardt, who's been doing some work in Oakland to look at patterns of behavior through what she's seeing in some of the videos that they've been working with her on, trying to create those things. But I think what we also have to start thinking about are what are those combinations of things that need to happen. The number one thing that I know I mentioned with you in regards to all of this is, what is the role of police? You have to define that role. You've got to tell them what their job is and is not, and then begin to make sure that you're hiring people to do what you're asking them to do, and not hiring the people that do not do what you want them to do, right? So, I mean, that's one piece. The other piece too is we don't deal with police culture here. And culture has never been factored into a lot of the things that I'm hearing talk about. You can have the best accountability models, and we've got folks who do it. We've got Brian here, where we know some oversight does move the needle, right? Again, what is the combination that we're looking for? But what we also don't know are what is it we're looking to address? What is the it? The community says we want to make sure officers do not stay, that are not welcome, they're not wanted here. There is 100% agreement on that. And I think for most, again, not all, most officers would agree with that. We don't want people here who are going to do things that are not going to be, not just illegal, but are against the profession. But what you also have to take into account when you're trying to figure out how do you sort of freeze and hold people where they don't do any more harm is what happens inside when you try to implement these types of things. And I don't hear that conversation, right? So even with all the accountability in the world, you still have the human factor here. And what's holding those folks who are making those decisions accountable? And I think that's really what a lot of folks are trying to do right now is figure out what are the combination of things we can do that don't continue to pile on harm. And you ask, well, what's the sky? For me, the sky is tell them what the role is. If the role is no longer to respond to the community for those things, then let's do that. Let's do the job description for that. Let's hire for that. Let's train for it. Let's hold people in discipline to that. But if we're going to continue to try to figure out along the way what the ultimate role will be, you still have to have something in place. You got to have something. There's just no way. And even as being a police officer for 30 years, there's just no way you can have someone or a group of people that are just left with that kind of power that doesn't have some version of accountability. It may not be perfect. It's the floor. And now I think what's happening, what should be happening, especially with community, you hear it from them. If you don't want to be here, if you can't do this job, if you don't value human life, you should not be doing it. Does that match up with the recruiting that's happening on the other end? Probably not. So there's lots of things in there, I think, that we have to account for. But again, for me, my ad was in training and in accountability. You've got to deal with culture. You can put all those mechanisms in place that you want, but if the culture is not going to allow you, if the union is not going to allow you to discipline people, if it's going to take 5 years for you to get resolution on a case, then it's bigger than just these few little recommendations. So hear you. I feel it from community. But now the bigger question is, what is that? What is the ultimate we're looking for?
Thank you. So other folks, who else would like to be in conversation with Dr. Keesee? Because she and I could have a conversation over coffee alone. We don't need to be here to do that. So I would love to have you all jump in. I have one question in the chat, Dr. Keesee, and that is, do you have a take on the Massachusetts legislation? So and I'm sure you're not keeping up on what every state is doing, but word came down that the kind of bipartisan effort has been put forward to move in the direction of making police officers more accountable, creating a certification system whereby if police officers engage in unlawful acts, they might produce police reports that they know included false information, et cetera. They can be decertified, and through decertification, then they could be held accountable by the law, but they can also be sued and all sorts of other things. So it makes them a little less immune than they have been. And so that's one of the key aspects of that. It puts officers on the line for the behaviors that they engage in that many of us do find of concern. So that's one of the things that I remember. I haven't gotten a chance to read the report closely, but this is one of the things I remember. What is your take? In some ways, it kind of sounds like what you were suggesting a few minutes before, but what is your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think that, so each state is different, right? So a lot of states already have certifications, right? They're post peace officer standards and training, that in order for you to be a police officer, you have to go through a certification process, and that there are mechanisms to decertify you. So if you are, brought up on felony charges and you're found guilty, you're decertified. So I think that's a start. But the other part, you need to think through here is, I may be post-certified in Massachusetts, but can I go to Colorado and get a job? And so what you don't have is, and this was part, I think, the federal legislation is this was broader kind of, whether it's a database or whatever, there's no broader across the line conversation around how do I keep going back and forth, and why do officers keep popping up that we know have a problematic history, and then all of a sudden they show up here. So decertification is one part, if the post board sticks to that, and and if the names are shared up, so that process is going to be equally as important, right? But the other part of this is not just you be decertified in Massachusetts, is that you can't work anywhere as a police officer. And I don't hear that. That's the other thing. So it is that if you can't be a police officer here, why would you be able to be a police officer somewhere else? This is different than being, than the sheriff's departments. And I think people don't understand sometimes the difference. When the sheriffs are elected, they often can choose who they want to bring in. So there's a lot more, ability to do that. And that is also a space that hasn't been talked about at all. So, just on the limited of what you've given me, a lot of states already have that certification process in a board that does that. I don't know if that's the plan, but that board has to be comprised of community people. It just does, because typically post boards are made up of retired officers or retired chiefs. And there's limited, if any, voice from community about what they believe is acceptable behavior for you to continue your job. So, it's a start.
Okay, so I have a question from Kathy. Kathy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I really like the part you say about culture. For a couple of reasons. I tried to file a complaint against a police officer and it got pretty bad. And then I also worked in juvenile corrections and it also got pretty bad there too. And I felt in both cases there was no fixing the situation. So I'm wondering, how do you fix the culture? And also then a second piece of that is, how do you fix the culture of the union that seems to sometimes even give police misinformation about that, anyway. So those are my questions. That's my question.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. And if I had the answer to both of those questions, you and I would not be sitting here. And I think that I'm looking at Don Reynolds, culture eats policy for breakfast, right? So you'll hear that said a lot, but it's true. It's absolutely correct. So I see that. But part of the things that, with culture is you have to begin to look at some of the narratives that continue through policing. You heard through a lot of those, I want to say, over the last 4 or 5 months or so, especially when you see, you talk about we're all blue, the thin blue line, those types of things, and how do they continue to sort of manifest themselves? I don't think you get an argument in regards to the profession is dangerous. I think that's it. But you also have a different conversation when you look at 911 calls that says, we know it's dangerous, but how dangerous is it really? Right? Because that's where the community is really starting to ask, right? So we know, we get it, and we understand people lose their lives and put their lives on the line. No one's taken away from that. But the question is around the narratives, the cultural narratives of policing. We see this when we see folks that are coming through, the academy. Where does that start? And a lot of folks will tell you, and a lot of researchers will tell you that culture, that mindset is shaped in the academy. How you perceive your role and what your role is going to be, and how you're taught about other people, other places, and all of those things. And I think so it really is about going back to my original statement that I always say, what is the role? What is the role that you want them to do? If it is to just respond to violence and violent crime, and that's it, that's a different type of officer in a way, and you might want to do some special training around that. And maybe everybody else can't be in that space, right? And so I think that as you think about that, and you say this because you also talk about the union work, around this. And, unions, I think how we think about this on a larger scale, when we think about really big unions like the, electrical unions and all those other things, were really designed to protect the rights of their workers, of the, the members. And the question becomes, is this the same thing? Are we talking about unions differently? And is this really what a union looks like that says we want to protect you at all costs, but then also is really playing a part in pushing even more community mistrust? And so a lot of this has to do with how people see themselves in this moment right now. You saw this, Kathy, when You had unions that supported one candidate, and you had Black officers and officers of color inside those police departments saying, no, this is not what I sign up for, and this is not what my community is about. So you're even starting to see that split there. But a lot of it is going to take pressure, pushing, change, a lot of the things that you see happening now as well. So
Thank you.
you're welcome, Kat. Thank you.
So we have first up Hildy Chandel and then Danielle Bird.
Danielle.
Does Hildy want to go first? I'm Danielle.
Hi, Danielle. You
Hi.
went first.
You can either way, Danielle, because part of what you're addressing is part of what I'm trying to get to as well, and understanding how do you bring communities and police together to effectively implement co-production.
And it's a great question, and it's going to be different. So since Hildy and Danielle are sort of going in the same direction, it's going to be different for different communities. And I think this was brought up a little bit earlier in our conversations, where you're going to have to know the community and what the community is asking. And you need to be very sensitive to that. And the community will help you understand, who you think should be at that table. You have to be very careful not to take that and try to say, well, we want to invite people, right? It's an iterative process too. So as you start with a small group of community, and communities really asking, one, what do we want? How do we get this done? And who do we need? What I found with the work that we're doing with the community can tell you who's already doing the work on the ground. The community can tell you who should be at the table. And that is the direction that you hear and that you listen to and you adhere to, right? So we have community members that would normally show up on the radar that are not large nonprofits that do that work. And so a lot of that work really is having communities say, for them, they'll say, here's who we know do the work. They're in our community. We want them in the community. They typically don't want people who are from other cities and states flying in to do this work. So listen to that ask. The other part you have to start thinking about when you do this work, and it'll be very different, the structures are also different. When we talk about in some cities, it's community-led, means that police aren't there at all, but they receive notes and updates about the progress and what's going on. So that's one way of looking at that. The other part of it as well is the structure shift depending on the community and the neighborhood. For example, in some of our communities, there's no like co-chair president. There's nobody here who's like the lead. There is usually a whole sort of group where one person will sort of be scribing and taking notes and helping get things in and get things out. So the structures are much looser than the way I was raised when you talk about how do you bring community and policing together, right? There was one community leader and everybody's like following the lead. They're determining who to invite. It's very different. And policing is not used to that because they're very used to going to known people. People who've already sort of backed that up or are, we call them sort of friends of police and cheerleading, which is nothing wrong with that, but you can realize how close that gets. You also have to have a really good understanding that a lot of folks really at first are not going to come. A lot of this is done by relationships, who we know, who's missing, who should be lifted up, and allowing some of those things to sort of take place on their own. What we usually try to do is just provide support. We have some of our cities where the governance itself, council, whomever, will pay community members to be facilitators, to take notes, to do those things. So you almost become a person that is just, creating a space, holding a space, stepping back and making sure a community moves in its natural way. And so it's very interesting that what we have bump up against now, even in co-production, is government really wanting to say who should be there, right? We think so-and-so should be there. And a lot of that conversation, in this work is the understanding of the role of police and government in that space. It's like, we understand, but this is not about you. It's literally like that. This is not about you right now. Some people take that well, others don't, right? It's really not about you. And so really it is about how do you get from community that support? And we found, and this is true no matter what, as you think about how do you co-produce that space, think about not just, as Brian brought up, the trauma, but over and over again, communities asked to repeat their stories and relive their trauma. And one of the things they're not done is compensated for that. And so, you know, what we have really sat with communities and with council and said, if you want, you know, to show support in some way, then get things translated, pay for facilitators, pay for scribes. I mean, we have college students scribing, you know, focus groups, and they're getting paid for that. So there are ways to do it. And I think what's interesting about, and what I've learned from this space, is that you have to suspend the tradition that you grew up with in this particular sort of, how do you make that work, right? Because there's a real urgent need, if it doesn't feel like it's moving fast enough for you, to sort of start to get in and try to direct it and drive it, and you just can't do it. And some folks don't have the patience for it, but I can tell you that rightfully so, it should take time, and it does take time. And so you have to have, you know, the patience for that. And we think that most do, but where we again find most of our pushback is, you know, that government structure, where they don't think that this should be moving the way it is. You know, we should need RFPs to do certain things. You know, we need to, so it's all of that and more. And you have to really sort of sit back and say, okay, how can we get that work done without needing all formal attachments? And that's a trust issue, right? So when you talk about data, when you talk about access, it's a trust issue. And so you don't have to sort of sit back, and we can all sort of freeze because we don't trust one another, but it's just not going to go anywhere. So that's a little bit about, you know, some of it's organic, but some of it is you making sure that you step back and that people are compensated and supported in ways in which they can think about the work and get the work done. And it takes time to do that. So Danielle, I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Keesee. You did identify many of the things that we're experiencing in our community right now. So we're trying to do this co-production work, and we have a structure where our mayor, and this is in our state law, I'm in Indiana, has a board of public safety. And so the mayor appoints members to that board. And we've been doing some other work in our community around racial justice, the future of policing, things like that. And so, but we've got the community members saying, you know, this is all coming from appointed people, right? This is not necessarily from the grassroots. And so we have a section of community members who are folks who are marginalized, who are vulnerable, who have lived experience, who are saying, you know, what you're saying in these meetings is not representative of all of our community. So we have some city council members who were really open to wanting to put together a commission on public safety advisory commission, but it's only made up of 11 people who are going to be you know, members of marginalized populations, and there's different sort of identities there. And so we've got tensions because it's really upset the people who have been doing this work, who the mayor has appointed. And so we're finding ourselves, I mean, we had a lot of opposition to doing this. And so, which is really disappointing. I'm a social worker, so I was really disappointed because the more opportunities that we can hear from folks, I thought the better. And so it's been a little surprising. So what you just identified, we're going through those tensions right now. And I don't know if you have any advice for us in our community about how to do this work, because public safety, as you said, is so much more than just about the police. And that's what we're trying to get at, is public safety doesn't mean the same things as it does to, you know, me. So I don't know, just advice, you know.
I can hear it in your voice. You're like, I'm there. One of the things that you could think about too is have the conversation with the community, and not you specifically. You may want to have someone where the community, there's usually one or two community folks that they trust that can come in and have a conversation and deliver messages back and forth. But you may want to ask someone, a trusted person, who could go to community and say, is there someone that, you know, we can pay for you, or we can, you know, support salary wise, that can help with the process as you're thinking through this. It doesn't always have to be you, right? And so think of it that way. And you can ask, community knows what they need and what they want and who, you know, who those people are. And we have to really stop thinking that we know. And we see this in other areas too, Danielle, is we can't ignore the politics of this, right? Because the politics are playing a really big role in this as well. And we have in some communities, it's mayor-led. In some communities, it's not. And then what we have to do is really have conversations with the mayor's staff, and then everybody else who's appointed, to say what this is and what this isn't. Because if you don't clarify that up front, you're going to continue to have this process right? Because someone wants to take a picture and say, I was involved. And you really have to, these are difficult conversations. And this is a part of that process where we've had to have conversations in a way with, you know, mayors and other people and say, what do you think you're going to get out of this process doing it this way, right? And then the other part of this is you need to wait and hear from the community about what the ask and the needs are, and where the patience is losing is that waiting. People are getting tired of waiting because, as people will frame it, this has been going on since May. Why don't we have an answer, right? And that's unfortunately, but that is the conversation we're starting to hear here. Is, you know, what's happening, and we, you know, need to put a stop to that, because that's not how this is going to go. So, you know, just think about that. Sometimes it's just take a pause. We put a lot of pressure on trying to solve a problem that didn't get this way overnight, and that's the other concern, right? You're talking about historical things that are not going to be solved in 90 days or a proposal in 120 days. It is an ongoing, it will be an ongoing process. So ask community the community knows, ask.
Thank you for that. Also, as a social worker, and I know I'm taking up a lot of space, but as a social worker, and we hear a lot about social workers should be responding to public safety concerns or certain types of calls. And we've had differences of opinion among social workers about whether police should hire the social workers or if social workers should be in a community-based setting. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts or, you know, pros and cons of that question.
It's going to be based on the community, right? Because what you're talking about is a co-response model versus just having, you know, the community itself be in the community, part of the community, and then they respond. And it is a community question you have to ask. And one of the things that we find is not only do you have to ask that, but you need to work towards that. Because then what starts to happen is that the community might say, we want this community-based model. I've heard a lot of communities say, we don't want officers to be the first ones at the door when there's a crisis, we want someone else. And the community is fine with it, but other people aren't. And then you start to, again, get this sort of power push back about, well, that's not happening. But one of the things you have to think about as you do this work and sit with this work is that if you try to cookie cutter their approaches across all communities, we're right back where we started. It is okay for a community and in a neighborhood to say, these are the first responders for this neighborhood. Because historically we haven't done that. And we haven't allowed for that. You know, we said, you dial 911, you get what you get. But it is okay to say, let's think about how we respond to public safety there. Let's not just think about the public safety needs as it's broader than that, right? You've got, you know, folks that are homeless. You have people that have food situations and job situations. And now we have this pandemic, so we have health situations. And so really thinking about how do each of those unique communities need to be served and invested in, as opposed to doesn't work for everybody, we're not doing it. So it's really backing yourself out of those old notions. And the politics of this is sticky. It really, really is. And we're seeing it in a lot of folks that we bring up the word political courage. There's one thing to talk about it. There's another thing to do it. And that's a whole different animal,
Thank you, Danielle and Hildy. So I think this is possibly the last question. Jamie, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I thought I was going to dodge speaking live by putting it on the chat. But I'm over in the UK, about to go to bed and listening with great interest. And I hear a lot of forward-facing stuff. I mean, we've had Black Lives Matter protests over here too. We've had riots in the past, but you guys have taken this to a whole different level. And I just struggle. I struggle to understand how you've got here. There must have been warning signs. And I think I mean, it's amazing what you're doing now. I'm a community Bobby, and the stuff you're doing about co-production is where we need to go to. You know, we've got our own problems, but all this forward-facing way out of it now. I've not heard anyone talk tonight. I've no doubt missed other conversations about how you got to where you were, and I just wonder how much of understanding how you got to where you are now, how much that holds answers maybe or clues towards how to get out. And if you anything to say just briefly about, you know, what is there a deficit that's led America to this position, and is it as simple as mending that deficit, or is it something different?
Jamie, first of all, thank you for staying up late. If that's what you're doing, But your question is really a good question because it requires understand the history and how we got here. And I would tell you US history, depending on how it was taught to you, but you know, with the social media now, you can pretty much find everything you're looking for. You wanna start with history, and the history in the way in which not only policing was created, but the way it showed up in the West. Because often what happens is you will hear people talk about Sir Robert Peel and the Peelian principles. And I have to remind people that only came as immigration started coming over to the Americas. That sort of notion was brought, but it was never implemented in a way in which that policing was done in the South and moved and migrated with those people. And so you should just really take a look at that pattern. The other thing that's really interesting about our history is the patterns of our history. You know, as I mentioned, Dr. Angel Acosta earlier does this work 400 years. As you go back and look at our 400-year progression, there's patterns here in regards to how things continue to show up, how issues continue to rise. In fact, the March on Washington this summer was almost, I want to say 47 years to the day, to the last one. You know, and so you have to really start thinking about why these patterns keep showing up. But then you really are remiss if you don't talk about how this country was founded and how people were not valued. When you talk about white supremacy, and when you talk about slavery, when you talk about how folks are viewed and seen, even to this day, it is a long history. So it's not one just of deficit. There's one of which there needs to be a recognition, there needs to be an understanding. And right now as a country, we don't even have an agreement, an understanding about where we are today. And so that's the hard part. And so we're all sort of, you know, waiting. I think some folks are waiting to see what the next administration is going to do. Others don't think there's going to be any difference whatsoever. I don't know. We have to see who shows up in the criminal justice spaces. But Jamie, it is a historical issue here that we are talking about, and we're trying to not only account for the past, account for this current moment, and then try to figure out what does the future look like that doesn't repeat these two things. So I know it doesn't answer your question directly, but I would say we can connect offline if you like, and we can have a longer discussion, but it is a deep, long conversation, very intertwined, very complicated, but it hits every aspect, social aspect of a person of color, Black or brown, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's transportation, and safety. So it's much broader than just this conversation. So I appreciate the question.
Thank you very much. That's a great start.
Well, I think that is a great way to end tonight's discussion. Dr. Keesee, I want to thank you again for joining us at the end of the semester and offering such really important insights. Definitely added to the conversation that we've been having over the course of the semester, and I so appreciate that. And I hope that you and I will stay in touch. So if everyone's okay with doing this, maybe we can all unmute and then give a good round of applause to Dr. Keesee. And hopefully at the very least you feel the spirit of it. We will be in touch, and you are of course welcome to attend the sessions next semester that we have. Certainly some of your insights will inform the kinds of questions and conversations we'll have next semester too. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
And